Hello. Right. Usually I have a nice posh intro, don't I? But whenever I've got a guest, it becomes an impossibility. Apparently we need to bend space and time for that to occur in our lives, so we haven't achieved it yet. But nonetheless, it's worth it because I've got Dr. Som Das, who you'll be able to see right here with me now, who is massively qualified. It's really nice to have a consultant forensic psychiatrist here. Lots of reasons why. Obviously, one of them being that, as I always say, that is not my area of expertise whatsoever. A lot of you also have had interactions with psychiatrists. Some have been great, some have not been so great. Dr. Som is incredibly easy to talk to and full of information. I've read his book recently, so part of the reason I wanted him on here today is because a lot of you are always intrigued and interested in just knowing more about the way that the whole of the system works per se. So what people feel like when they're treated with psychological or psychiatric conditions, and also I suppose the more extreme end. And you know, anybody who follows my crime channel, and Dr. Som's got an amazing channel as well on YouTube, which we'll link as well. One of the things that I think that we always try to keep in mind is the humanness between mental health, mental illness, and just being an ordinary existing human being with the neuroses that we experience, just being alive. And I think that what's great about this book, In Two Minds, and by the way, just to put it out there, Dr. Soham has not paid me for this. There'll be somebody, won't they, in the trollverse going, oh my God, she's managed to get a professional to sponsor her. It's not that at all. I wanted to read this book, and one of the reasons for that is because you guys asked me to recommend books. And the reason that I wanted to read this book is because what Dr. Som does really well in it is, if you think, guys, about what we consider in our minds, particularly when we're looking at crime, the most depraved of humanity in your mind. You know, when you think about that, what comes across in this book is the fact that Dr. Som's able to explore the reality of how that isn't true, actually, that people aren't all psychopathic narcissists who are going out, or sociopathic individuals who are causing harm to society. You know, there are individuals who are basically a product of so many different things. And to say that, Dr. Som, as well, some of the things that I love about this is just the way that you talk about your experience from what I would say novice, although I appreciate we're always novices to some degree in life, we're always learning, but novice to expert, and how you've managed to hold your humanness all the way through that, whilst getting a little bit more angsty as well. I like that. With respect, you get a little bit more, this isn't acceptable, this needs to be better, and so on and so forth throughout the book. But it's really great. So before we kind of start the questions, because there's loads of questions tonight, could you just intro yourself? Tell me a little bit about yourself. Also intro your YouTube channel, because we have a lot of people who come to this who like my crime channel and they'll love your crime channel. So explain this and explain this.
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Emma, for having me on your channel. I'm a big fan of yours, and I just really appreciate the opportunity for your platform. Also, you said you weren't going to do a big intro, but that was a pretty big intro. You big me up more than I think I can big up myself. So I think what I'm going to say now is going to pale into insignificance, what you've already said. But yeah, I am, as you said, a consultant forensic psychiatrist. So what I do for a living is I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders. So people that have committed fairly serious crimes, everything from assault to sexual offences to attempted murder, and then murder. And everybody's always fascinated with the murder. That's what I always get asked about the most in interviews, which is fine. It's the most interesting part, I guess. And for people that have done those things but have or suspected of having a mental illness, so either personality disorder, you're an expert on this, to schizophrenia, to bipolar, to psychopathy, and everything in between. So that's what I do as a day job, and I am trying my best to inch my way into the media, but it's a struggle. It's harder than assessing violent criminals by far. So yeah, I've got this YouTube channel, A Sight for Sore Minds, and it is a bit eclectic. It's a bit chaotic, disorganized. It's just anything.
It's funny. It's funny as well, and that's not being disrespectful in any way, shape, or form to the content that you talk about. But you allow a breather when you're watching your content, which is just like I can just take a step back and just kind of enjoy that for a moment before going back into the really hardcore area that we're talking about.
It's basically littered with dad jokes, I think is how to put it. So I attempt to be funny. I think I do some decent jokes. I think some of them fall a bit flat, but that's cool. I'm used to that. So yeah, I do try and inject some humor into it. It's a fine line because you obviously can never be laughing at the victim. You've got to be laughing at the situation or yourself or the perpetrator. So I've always tried to keep that in the mind. But yeah, I try and make it silly, try and make it surreal. I just pick random topics that I think are interesting and blabber on about them in front of a camera.
So the book, what was it that prompted you to read that book? And also because I think that when you look at the title and if you look at the write-up, even though it's really great, the write-up, I think that potentially if you're an individual who maybe doesn't know a great deal about psychiatry or forensic psychiatry or courts and so on and so forth, you might think that the book is more academic, less general, but actually it's really general, the book. That's what I found really interesting to read. It's really easy to read. You feel like you know a lot more about the area, but without being, shall we say, made to feel like a PhD would be helpful before you pick it up. It's just not like that at all. It's funny as well.
Yeah. So I think the book came about because I actually tried to write fiction, and I wrote a novel. Spent ages, almost a couple of years writing it. Then got an agent, so got really excited. I was like, finally, I've made it. And then it didn't get picked up by any publishers at all. So the whole thing was a bit of a damp squid by the end of the 2 years. But everybody was interested in me writing a non-fiction kind of professional memoir type thing. I think this was roughly about the time that Adam Kay got huge with, trust me, with
I'm a doctor, yeah. It's gonna hurt, yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna hurt. And so I kind of reluctant. To be perfectly honest with you, Emma, I didn't think. It sounds bizarre to say this now, but I didn't think what I did was interesting enough for people to want to read about. And I think that's just because when you do it all the time, you forget how sort of fascinating and sensationalist and lurid it is, or it can be, I should say. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I didn't want to over sensationalize it. And I didn't know that there was a way to do it without doing that until I actually started writing it. And then I did start writing it. And it just kind of, it was a lot easier than I was expecting it to be. I've got a terrible memory as well. So I didn't even know that I had all these good stories. I literally couldn't remember half the cases. Then I got
it is amazing how people underestimate just their ordinariness being quite extraordinary when you explore it. I think that's what comes across. So I think it's really interesting for people who maybe don't think about redemption in the way that maybe mental health should be thought of, because a lot of it is about redemption, isn't it? It's about the fact that people can do the most terrible things, either in moments of genuine, you cover cases like where somebody's murdered in psychosis, for example, but you also cover some really heartfelt experience of individuals that you can kind of go, okay, that makes sense. And it's not just that, as I say in the TV world, and anybody who watches me and anybody who comes to these lives, nothing's black and white. And I find that really difficult when we kind of want to do that, the black and white thinking, because it isn't really helpful. There's no nuance and it doesn't really explain what's actually happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And connected to that, and I'm sure you've talked about this yourself many times in some of your videos, which I've seen, is that it's an uncomfortable truth, but most of the perpetrators are victims in one form or another. So the person standing in front of you might be a nasty piece of work. They might have done something horrible. They might have, committed a sexual assault against a child. They might have killed a family member. But at one point, if you go far back enough into their childhood, I'd say almost all, with a very rare exception, 95, 99% of the patients that I've seen for criminal trials have faced, poverty, abuse, really lax parenting, lack of boundaries, homelessness, drug and alcohol issues, just horrible, horrible lifestyles. And I think that's something that we forget when we have all these sensationalist documentaries. And I'm part of it. I'm not. I'm happy to admit that I'm a hypocrite. I give my sound bites as well. But I think it's easy to forget that the people that we're talking about that have done these horrible things are also victims in one form themselves.
Definitely. And also we give our sound bites in TV, but then they literally steal all the bits that are important, throw that on the edit floor and just use words like narcissist and psychopath, and you watch it and you're like, you don't need to employ me. Just use the cuts from the other things to just interject in the appropriate places for you. And the other thing about television versus reality is that when you said about you write a book or, you start doing these things on TV and then it's quite difficult to break into, part of that is because I think that when you look at particular personality types, there's a certain type of personality that thrives in the media. And if you're compassionate and empathic, you don't always thrive in the media because of it. That's all I'm saying. But hopefully you'll be seeing me and Dr. Soham in some stuff together, because we've been working behind the scenes. There's some exciting things that are just starting to unfurl. So before we move on with the questions, and there's quite a few areas, and I've said please stay, and he's agreed. So now foolishly he's a part of the live, whether he wishes to leave or not. By the way, we will be linking the book at the bottom so that you can kind of go along and buy it. It's got brilliant reviews on Amazon, but I've read it and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
But more because I felt like I got to know you during it, and also I like the fact that you're quite challenging in some certain areas. And I think that one of the things that a lot of people with mental illness and mental health issues per se, some of them have not had the greatest experience with the whole world of psychiatry and psychology and therapy, just full stop, all of those. And it just reminds you within the book that actually sometimes there's just an unfortunate connection with characters that you just don't connect with. And that's common. It happens every single day of the week. We like people, we don't like people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you work with mentally disordered offenders, a lot of them will have personality disorders. And, for them to get into these secure units that we work in, then they have usually like an antisocial personality disorder, or a litany of violence. So somebody that's committed violence for most of their adult life, a proportion of those people are going to be challenging. They're going to be difficult. There's no way around that. So what I'd like to think that I did in the book is I didn't try and sidestep that or excuse that. I kind of explain that some people are difficult, but equally some people are funny. There's lots of different aspects of any one personality, I think. So the same person who's done something horrible on paper or in the case reports also has a human side and can make me laugh, and I can kind of, I wouldn't say ever be friends with, because you always have to have that distinction, but I can relate to them,
like that funny, part of like them.
And then I think another day you might dislike them because they change their behaviors.
A lot of people who get in touch with us, and some of the questions will probably cover this tonight, one of the big problems that people have, particularly when it's in abusive relationships, is the fact that they genuinely know that the abuse is totally abhorrent. They know that they don't want that abuse, but 95% of the time the partner is not abusive. And it's really difficult when people are like, just leave, just get out, just stop being there. Because what you're asking is for somebody to take the tiny part of the person that should be rejected, of course, should be abandoned. We all agree with that. But we're asking them to lose the 95% that actually might have been really helpful and might have been really important. And I think that, again, that ability to just accept that human beings are complex, we're full of idiosyncrasies, we're full of polarities even, particularly when it comes down to personality disorders. And just before we start, guys, because this is just for me, I'm going to own this before I ask your questions, that this is specifically because I'm a bit obsessed at the moment and did get into a row with a journalist from the Express. And you know that I don't like doing that stuff, guys. I'm not somebody who likes being in any papers, particularly because they just lie. But the point is, on this one, I couldn't back down, because I basically wrote a comment, and some of you might have seen it, that I've been a little bit on the obsessed every 5 minutes that I've got free, watching the Depp versus Heard case. And the reason for that is not because I have some kind of weird celebrity issue with either of them. It's because when it's domestic abuse and it involves men as well as women, I think that sometimes there is a real skewed position in that. And I've got to ask you, Dr. Soham Das, I've got to ask you, I feel that just bringing in her personality disorders as some kind of reasoning behind violence is a little bit unfair, because so many people suffer from BPD and various other issues within that kind of spectrum who would never raise a hand to anyone and actually probably harm themselves more. But equally, what has really surprised me is the fact that it's undeniable that the abuse has also come from Amber Heard. And I put out the fact that it's something that we need to start questioning, because men are still finding it difficult to come forward in abusive relationships, and they get laughed at when they say it, and there's an acceptability about female to male violence that isn't the other way around. And I have gone from clearly a few years ago thinking, well, Depp is an abuser because of what I was reading, etc., to now going, wow, isn't it more complex to actually see those idiosyncrasies of the relationship, and also she was highly abusive to him. Have you seen any of that are you doing any of that on your YouTube?
Actually, yeah. So I've done
brilliant.
it's almost like we set this question up. So my last two videos have been about, my last video that was out yesterday was about Amber Heard and her diagnosis of borderline histrionic PD. And the video before that was about Johnny Depp self-harming. And I suppose my thoughts were, especially about Amber Heard, were first of all, I think you got to take it a little bit with a pinch of salt when you've got somebody that's diagnosing in this kind of context. So it's not like a clinician like yourself or me who's trying to give somebody an understanding of things that have gone wrong in their life or certain personality traits they have, and try and give it a name and an explanation and let them know they're not the only one. And, these are the common treatments. That's therapeutic. But when you're doing it for a trial, then it's kind of, I mean, I do give evidence. I do diagnose people, so I can't be a hypocrite and say that it's inaccurate. No. But you've got to wonder what is the benefit of making that diagnosis. Obviously, they're not doing it for Amber Heard. They're doing it to use as a weapon for Johnny Depp's defense. So that's one thing I'd say. And the other thing I'd say is that I think for personality disorders, especially borderline, and maybe to a less degree, maybe more so for antisocial, it's kind of a chicken and an egg situation, because you're describing behaviors that relate to a diagnosis, but the diagnosis is dependent on those behaviors. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, are you actually saying anything of substance when you're describing what Amber Heard does? Are you saying it's because of this personality disorder? And if so, does that mean that it's a thing that she can't control? Well, that's not accurate. Right. It's actually part of it, right? So I guess what I'm saying is it's hard to make the distinction of where does the diagnosis stop and the behavior start, and where is the
it's really interesting
point for responsibility.
Yeah, that is really interesting. But I definitely now think that Johnny Depp was definitely abused as well, which has been really intriguing for me to watch.
What do you mind if I ask, what was the fallout with the journalist then? What was that about? What did you say?
I said that it was time that we started to take female to male violence seriously too, that it's very difficult and uncomfortable for men to come forward, and that no matter what happens, whether he's found guilty or she's found, guilty to be lying, the point is that it was not a one-way street in their relationship. Because I think that until we're kind of having those conversations, then it's not good for women or men. And the response was that Amber's basically innocent and it's been heard in the UK, and which is a completely incompatible relation to actually what's played out in the States. And also it was a different argument. It was against Dan and the Sun, actually, wasn't it, over here? For me, it's kind of been like, wow, when men come forward and say, actually, I've been physically abused in a relationship. I've had a lot of guys get in touch with me since then saying, thank you for just kind of having that conversation. Like, at no point am I saying that either party is completely innocent, because look, toxicity lives in relationships. That's another thing that I feel like we've almost pathologized, is this idea that people don't have a row and shout at each other. Like, I practice something in my home called compassionate parenting. I don't raise my voice. I don't hit my children. I never have done. But, everybody else has different things. I have a friend that swears that, the only way she can get any response from her kids is from standing at the bottom of the stairs and screaming as loudly as possible for at least 3 opportunities before they do anything. I appreciate things are different in different homes. But certainly toxicity experience is quite common in relationships, where you say and do horrible things. You don't mean it. You're not trying to be abusive, but actually in that moment you say something regrettable, you apologise for. I think if we heap all of that into this is abuse, as in the definition of what abuse can be, then we almost deny the real experience of people who've been horrifically abused and who've been abused in domestic situations like this. So it was a conversation where she was basically saying that there's no way Johnny was ever going to be abused. And that I find really difficult, because I think it's dismissive of the experience.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're like, you're just saying that we have to keep an open mind, because it does happen both ways. And as you say, it's not recognized. Mostly towards women. Yeah, definitely mostly towards women. Look, hey, it's mostly a gendered crime. It's mostly men towards women. Simple as. Maybe women are more known for poisoning their partners and infanticide. It's not like women are always great. It's just that in the domestic abuse situations, we tend to be less physical in that way. But that doesn't mean we can't be coercive. But I just think that it's time that we have those conversations so that we free and liberate men from finding it that they've got to get silenced. Anyway, let's get on with this, otherwise I'll be carrying on forever and everyone will be like, my God, Emma, I sent you a question. So let's start. Hi everybody, it's lovely to see you, and sorry I'm not saying hello because I can't really see everybody. I've seen quite a few people who are on Facebook, but the others I can't see just because my screens are full with other things. So, hello Emma, Kenny and Dr. Som, can I please have a shout out?
I myself do psychology, and that's because of you, Emma. Thank you. You inspired me to achieve my goals, and also my fiance, Glenn Hollings, made me believe in myself and helped me. Well, we're both saying hello. Say hello there. Say hello.
What's her name? We can't shout her out without a name.
It actually doesn't say her name. Just say.
Right, okay, so anonymous
congrats. Yeah. Wait a minute.
Okay.
We're going to get it now. It's unusual we get shout outs on this channel. So yeah. Well, that's fantastic, by the way, and I appreciate it. But as much as you're saying that I've influenced you, I hope that I've had a positive impact, but really it's your choices that have made a difference. So I would like to take claim, as would Dr. Soham tonight, but the truth is it's your hard work that's getting you there. Hello, lovely. Do you have any advice? Oh, on selective mutism. My daughter will be 4 at the beginning of June, and she is showing signs of autism and selective mutism. Yeah. This doesn't worry me, but she is due to start school in September, and I was wondering how to go about it. I'll tell you what I think, and then Dr. Soham, if you don't mind coming in and expressing from your perspective. And just to put it into context here, obviously Dr. Soham is a psychiatrist. That means that he is an individual who has done massive assessments on individuals of all different ages and types. So mine's going to be a different take potentially on his, and I would weight it in his direction. Excuse me. I've had the worst chest infection. It was like a 1980s cold. So selective mutism, and I've treated selective mutism. In selective mutism, particularly in primary school and pre-primary school. So that's really my area. I will not deny I have worked with one selective mute when they were 14. This is, in my experience, highly atypical. It tends to be younger. Also, it's recognised as being within the anxiety spectrum, which is understandable, because when you literally physically don't feel like you can speak, you can imagine that it comes from a position and a place of feeling hyper anxious. Also, there is the belief that there is obviously some kind of genetic impact because of the fact we have temperament. We're all born with a temperament. For those of you who are new to the channel because you knew that Dr. Soham was coming on and were like, I'm going to get some real advice off a professional today. Well, I always talk about my own story. I did used to put my skirt over my head if I saw boys walking down the street when I was a child because I was too terrified to speak. It was a terrible coping strategy. Nobody should think that showing their underwear is better than just being quiet. But that was my temperament, and I've manipulated that, and that's the great thing about humanity and our experience. We can manipulate a lot of our temperaments even when we still feel things like being hyper shy. Now, there is autism involved in this as well. So there's two things going on there, and they're obviously going to be to some degree combined because it's in one individual. But I think mutism, if we were just treating it typically, well, we can do things like grading exercises. So certainly that would be where you have an individual that you feel safe speaking in front of, because for those of you who don't know what selective mutism is, it means that a child can chat normally and absolutely be typical in their exchanges around what we would consider safe people that they know, people they've grown up with, particular friends, animals, all of these things that just are really familiar to them. And to all intents and purposes, communication is fine, but then somebody else enters or a new situation arises or they go someplace else and it just creates this hyper anxiety response, and the response means that it shuts them down. And it's not that they don't want to speak, it's not that they're being obstinate, it's not that they're being difficult, which are some of the kind of words that have been associated with individuals who don't speak freely. Because what we have is somebody will say, oh, this is my daughter, Julie. And somebody will say, hi, Julie, and Julie will ignore them. And then it's like, Julie's being naughty, but she isn't being naughty. This is a real response. So in grading exercises, what I used to do is have a parent go into school. The parent would do work with the child during the time that they're sat in the school corridor. We would move closer and closer and closer. We would then introduce an individual such as a learning support assistant. Back in the day, when you used to actually get like proper support in schools, the funding was there. You could have like somebody full time. It's changed now, so it might just be a couple of hours a day. You could do that. And then in time, you'll introduce particular peers. And it tends to be that whilst you might not get a child who becomes uber confident and can just chat to everybody, it breaks down some of those issues within that behavior. Also, like a modeling or mirroring behavior type is helpful, where You can video a child in a comfortable space, having a chat with you, nattering, and you can play the video of them and just congratulate them, being very specific about, isn't it great when you were talking about your teddies? Isn't it fantastic when you were describing how you love playing with your Lego? That's really helpful as well. And another thing that I would do, not everybody agrees with this, so this is just my experience of how it's worked within my client group and cohort. If I am going somewhere, I will inform the adults that I have a selective mute child, because what I want to do is remove pressure. I don't want it to be that the child feels that everybody's going to come over and have conversations. It's much more that I allow them to just feel like a part of the environment without the pressure of exposing themselves in a conversational way to that environment, or feeling in these cases that they can't. You also have autism though, suspected. So with autistic children as well, one of the things that we see within these young people, and again, autism is a massive spectrum. It's massive. So you could say an autistic child, as in an atypical and typical child, are more similar than two children who are considered neurodiverse and autistic. So again, it's not a one size fits all. But what we can say is a lot of the time they're more willing to kind of just be who they are in the moment and not necessarily do what they're being advised to do, because there is more of a kind of, this is how I feel and I don't really want to engage. So you may have some additional issues there, and I can't really comment on how the autism will be treated because that's very specific, and I've always said that autism was not my field, but selective mutism really was, and it tends to be a very, very positive outcome. It really does, with the right kind of help. So try to reduce the anxiety and stress in your home. Make sure that you do things like meditation, get them exercising, have a lot of fun, teach them to just enjoy being present in your home and enjoying that safe space as well, and just trust that in time with those kind of impacts there will be a difference. Now I'll go over to you. So what do you think that from your perspective?
You took all the good answers away, Emma.
Well, that's better than you going, oh my God, what is this woman talking about?
So I'm happy to answer. I should preface this by saying that I work with adults and I've done most of my training in adults. So I don't profess to be an expertise in these areas, but I do have some experience. So the thing I'd say about selective mutism, first of all, is exactly like you said. It is usually some form of either extreme anxiety, either extreme shyness or anxiety. Yeah. And sometimes it can be nipped in the bud, and it can just be as simple as a child coming out of their shell. And that can be through what you were talking about. So your graded therapy, play therapy. So it might be that the child feels really uncomfortable to interact with other people of their own age or otherwise in a pressure kind of setting. So that's in a party, in a restaurant, at school, but they might be able to gradually get used to socializing with other people in a therapeutic kind of structured environment, just like you were talking about. So this reminds me of systemic desensitization. It's not the same thing, but it's the same kind of concept. Yeah. So for your viewers that don't know, that would be if you have some sort of phobia. So you're scared of a specific situation, and then through therapy, you get exposed to that situation in gradual increments whilst you work on relaxation therapies, whether it's, breathing or concentration. So the theory behind it is that as you kind of level up and get used to taking on that anxiety, but still feel relaxed, knowing that your adrenaline response is not going to, is finite, so it will run out at some point. Then you go on to the next bit. So what you're talking about isn't quite the same, but it's quite similar. It's kind of doing that, but with socializing. So it might be with you and mother sitting in with another family member, or with a neighbor, and then with the therapist, then with the teacher. So the scariness of each social interaction increases very gradually over time. So that in itself helps a lot of children, but sometimes it's a bit more persistent and a bit more severe, and it just takes longer to get over. I suppose the other thing I'd say is that 4 is still pretty young. So somebody who could be at 4, it could be very different if they were, 5, 6, 7. You said that you met somebody at 14. I've never clinically seen somebody like that, but I imagine if they get to that kind of age, right, then it must be very hard to overcome.
Really hard.
Because you've already hit most of your boundaries in terms of growing. I suppose the other thing that I would say is that I think it's a fine line between letting people know and not drawing too much attention.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what you said before, Emma. If you kind of pre-warn when you're in social situations, then you will take away the pressure from that child being absolutely paralyzed with fear, feeling that they have to perform because people are trying to start a conversation with them. But at the same time, you don't want to draw too much attention. You don't want to, for example,
Absolutely.
be letting other kids in the playgroup or in the class think, something wrong with this kid, which will obviously just paradoxically draw even more attention to
Yeah, I
them.
agree.
So that's quite, I think, suppose individual cases, really, you have to figure out how to do that in a kind of empathetic and constructive way.
I think that's really, really helpful. Um, we've got Emma. Can you explain why sometimes I just feel so flat, especially at home, feeling out of sorts and not sure why? Do you want to take that first of all? Because I just will go on otherwise. So it's why do you think I feel just sometimes so flat, especially at home, feeling out of sorts and not sure why?
Yeah. So I suppose if we're looking at it logically, it's either some sort of mental health issue or it's not. If it isn't, then it could be maybe a social issue. So it could be that things are not going, not quite as exciting or as productive in your life as you want to be. So there's so many potential factors that could be from not getting enough sleep to not getting enough exercise, to having issues with your relationships, whether they be, your partner's romantic relationships, family, friends. So usually those things will be obvious, but not for everybody all the time, because I think we get into these kind of mundane cycles. So I suppose the first thing that I'd be doing would be looking at the kind of the social strata and seeing if you think there's key things that are missing and fix them. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say this, but most things have some sort of solution. It's just about whether the time and effort and approach that you take to find that solution. And they could be drastic solutions. They could be changing your friendship group. They could be ending a relationship. They could be, moving into a different environment. So all of those things in a nutshell is how I would deal with the social aspect. And then if it's not that, then by process of elimination, then we're talking about something that could be a mental health issue. So I'm trying not to use the word mental illness, because I think that's on the higher end of the spectrum. And it could be something like depression. It could be just like a temporary or a less severe issue like dysthymia. So for your viewers, depression would usually have other associated symptoms. So it's not just having a low mood. It's just not just feeling flat. It's also things like problems with your sleep, your appetite, concentration, possibly losing weight, lack of libido, problems with memory, problems with energy and motivation. I think something that's a key for me, probably one of the most core symptoms, is what we call anhedonia. So that's not enjoying something that you previously enjoyed. So are you going through the motions and doing something that you did a year or 2 years ago, whether that's reading or going out with friends, going out for a meal, cooking, whatever it is, whatever your jam was, if you're doing that now and it's not giving you the sense of pleasure, then possibly you might have depression. And if that's the case, then first line, I would see your GP, ideally for some kind of talking therapy. And if all that fails, or if it's more severe than that, then you might have to think about medication like antidepressants. But I'm always quite reluctant to suggest that unless everything else has been kind of examined and tried first.
Oh my God, I mirror that completely. I always say on this channel, I'm far more meditate than medicate. And it's not to say for 1 minute that medication can't be absolutely transformative for a percentage of people, but I think it's tiny in comparison to all the things that you just noted then about getting strategic. I think that one of the biggest and fundamental shifts for me that I've explored in the last 20 years is that when I first started practicing, I would have young people particularly, and young adults in particular, because they were two of the frame areas that I worked for a long time, they would express feeling sad. So if you put I feel sad into Google, you get to like page 3 or 4 before sadness is mentioned. In fact, what it says is depression, depression, depression. So we're almost schooling people to believe that when they feel sad or flat or a bit lost, and these are all totally human experiences. In fact, it is what marks being human. It's what marks being informed by our emotional prompts that allows us to see, okay, what needs to shift and change? And when I see the words flat, well, first of all, it brings to mind a sense of feeling stuck, I think feeling flat and feeling stuck is kind of the same. You don't feel like there's a lot of progression. You don't feel there's a lot of excitement. There's a stagnancy. And one of the brilliant things about that, and sometimes we don't look at the core negatives and think there's anything positive within it, but within stagnancy, without trying to patronize, because these are real feelings that you're having, you have to remember it's before movement. It always has to exist before movement. Before progress, there is always a stillness, and it can be frustrating as hell. But it could be that this moment in time is teaching you and informing. And as Dr. Soames just said, one of the progressive things that you can do is go, okay, let's get strategic about, firstly, what's shifted and changed, what's maybe been lost. What is it that I expected to have here now? If it's not here now, what am I being informed by knowing that that's not there, that I need to further explore and achieve? Because I think we get to certain ages as well. And at certain ages, we have this crazy belief system that because some broken blueprint told us that if we hadn't achieved A, B, or C by this point, then we've lost it. And it's just not true. There are examples throughout history, throughout time, and there will be in the future as well, that we'll all wake up to in papers, where people who essentially don't fit the mold of the expectation that we've had in our mind about success and who can achieve it, but that suddenly just crash onto the scenes because they followed their passions and they found that absolute vision and they just went for it. There are great examples of that, like Susan Boyle, who obviously won Britain's Got Talent. She could sing, but she didn't fit the normal prototype of our experience of stars. There are people every single day of the week who refuse to be quiet just because of their chronology or because of their previous experiences. They think, you know what, I don't feel satisfied and I'm tired of people telling me that I should be, even though I've not pursued my plan A. So the other thing I'd say is when you're looking at why do I feel flat? When I'm at work, I'm kind of okay. Well, I'm distracted. There are other people taking that distraction and helping me with it. So you can kind of coordinate an existence outside of ourself in the home where, you know, it can be okay, and that's great to celebrate. And it also is indicative that there's probably, as Dr. Soames was saying, isn't potentially a major mental health issue there because you're okay in those spaces. It's when you're home, it's when you're in your own space, and there'll be a lot of you listening to me now going, yeah, that's me. It's like you walk in the door and the silence arrives and the distractions aren't there, and the mind and the emotions are working together to go, hey, something needs to change. And it's not there to punish you. It's not there to put you in pain. It's like, listen to me. And then if you listen and you stop believing in the voices of the critics, and there are millions out there who'll tell you that, what do you mean you want to go and be a singer? What do you mean you want to go and be a creative? What do you mean you want to give up and be a photographer? It's all very well to listen to the voices of the critics, but that's why so many of us fundamentally feel unhappy. So it's like, use this period to inform you, not to retain that stagnancy. That's my feelings within that.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said, Emma. Just to add to that, I think there's some people that I occasionally see in my clinical practice who are confused because on paper it seems that they've got everything, the archetype of what we expect is a perfect life, quote unquote. So, you know, they might have a good job, might have decent house, car, money, relationship, etc., but they still feel that something's missing. And I think my answer to that would be that people are so diverse that for many people, most people even, maybe that's enough. And for people that are lacking some of those things, people that are in dead-end jobs or struggling with, you know, relationships, to them it might seem that that's all you need. And that they could be right. Maybe when they get there, those people will be happy. But when you think about it, people do bizarre things for pleasure, don't they? You mean everything from stand-up comedy, which some people would find absolutely petrifying, other people would think of it as a thrill, to cage fighting, to, you know, traveling the world, to packing up your six-figure trader job to go out to move to Cornwall and start surfing. And I guess my point is that people do these things and their lives are transformed.
Yeah.
So you just got to have, but finding that thing I think is difficult, and it's not always that obvious, and it's harder for some people than others. But I think for most people there is something out there, but it might just be a matter of taking your time to try different things and figure out what it is that you think is missing.
Exactly.
That's a challenge for you.
You know, I saw an article the other day, and okay guys, I will be really honest with you. I'm a little bit conflicted about how I feel about the article. But what it was an article on a Victoria's Secrets model, And she's the first Down syndrome Victoria's Secret model. Now, it's not the fact that she's Downs that makes me go, oh, I'm a little bit conflicted about that, because it's more to do with, do I believe that the objectification and sexualization, whether she has an ultimate similar awareness to the other models about that. But hey, I'm not going to judge that. What I'm saying is, if you think 10 years ago that a Downs girl was going to walk down a Victoria's Secret model runway looking far better in the underwear than I ever would, no one would have perceived that. But it takes somebody with a dream. It takes somebody with a willingness to just refuse to accept no. I'm a believer that there are so many doors, and lots of them just slam in your face, but there's always someone who's going to open it and make you a cup of tea. And having that mindset is really, really helpful. Dr. Soam and me both work in the media, and it was really honest of what he said at the very beginning, which is, when you're trying to get into these kind of things, all you often feel is frustration. And I wrote a piece on professional ghosting the other day, because that happens a great deal in life. And I was like, hey, I've been in 14 years in the media now, and I get ghosted like every other day. It's just par for the course, and it's about them, not me. But what I'm trying to get across at is, when you feel a little bit like things aren't going in the right direction, then anything that doesn't go your way can feel like a really, really painful experience. And the deal in life is, if you stop then, if you let it crush you, well, then you've made that choice, but it's ultimately your choice. Whereas arguably, if you see things slightly different, if you reframe it and you go, I can see things from a different perspective, and I'm not going to accept that I can't do A, B, or C. I might be 10 years older than the others doing A, B, or C, but I'll be 10 years wiser, 10 years braver. They're really important. So to that flatness, don't see it as a flatness. See it as a learning experience that's waiting for you to create some foundations and buildings on it. And you just haven't quite figured the landscape you're creating. But you're creating that landscape just by acknowledging the fact that it feels flat right now. And I guess that a lot of you will resonate with that. We talk a lot about that right now. Actually, the last few years, so many of us. And even I can own it. I look back at who I was 2 years ago. We all know how I felt about COVID. I've been an advocate for being against lockdowns. I've been very clear about my voice on any kind of mandates for human beings, because I believe in autonomous human experience. I believe that decision making is really important to being at least at peace with yourself. And that all stems from a belief that I feel that knowing we have our opportunities to make decisions over our lives, better or for worse, is within our responsibility. And that's empowering, and sometimes it's frustrating, but it's useful. But I know a lot of us have felt that way. The next one, bless. Hi Emma, I've just had my second miscarriage in the last year. I feel like I'm letting my boyfriend down. I'm also pushing him away as I can't give him a family. This is having an impact on my mental health too. I feel like I'm not good enough. Any advice to help me would be appreciated. Thanks. I'll take this first purely because it's my experience. So I've had 5 miscarriages. We talk about self-disclosure here, and that's not to say I understand where you are. My experience and your experience will be totally separate. Both of my boys are fertility boys, as in I've had treatment for them. So whilst I don't know your experience of this, I'm saying I can appreciate that it's full of frustration. First of all, you look around and it's a little bit like if you've bought a red car, all of a sudden there are a million red cars around. When you want to get pregnant, there are a million people getting pregnant, and you have to wear a smile on your face, and you have to be gracious, and you have to be kind, and all the while you're questioning and doubting who you are and what's going on with your body. So I just want to acknowledge that. Secondly, whilst it is a mutual loss losing a child when you are pregnant, it does not feel that. In my experience of working with women, in my experience of working with relationships, when a woman loses a child, of course it is a shared loss, but it is not a shared feeling to the degree that it will be for the female. It is your body. It is your experience of that body. Your hormones will have shifted. There will be a million things going on. And anybody who gets pregnant, you plan their university before they've even got to the first trimester. That's the deal. We do that because we're so hopeful. So we're not just talking about the physiological loss, the hormonal changes, the feeling isolated because it was your body, the feeling like your body's working against you. You've had a whole future stolen. And then what happens is everybody just thinks you should get on with it. It's like the platitudes. Well, it was probably chromosomally wrong. It's probably Mother Nature knowing what's best. As if the death of your baby can be seen as some kind of positive arrow shot by nature. And you're carrying all of this around while saying to yourself, why my body? Now, you've had 2, and I know that before you get to 3, you're not really going to get that much help, and that's another big issue. So I'm not going to walk away from the fact that you now have to think, well, what about the next one? Because when you flick a coin, sometimes you can get 5 heads before you get a tails. We know that probabilities work that way. It could be, and I'm going to use the word unlucky in very light inverted commas, on the basis that it's not unlucky when you're grieving, it's harrowing and traumatic. But I'm saying that it could just be that those 2 pregnancies, for whatever reason, the next one's going to happen, it's going to be fine. Let's be honest, you can get pregnant. That's an amazing thing. That's an amazing thing, because it means that with IVF, if you have to go down that route, it's going to be much more likely to have a credible positive outcome because you can fall pregnant. Also, none of that's going to make up for how you feel right now. My words to you are more about acknowledging that this is a space that is painful for you, but it's also a position of progress. Don't get me wrong, the loss isn't progressive, of course not, but there is some confirming elements here. One, not everyone knows they want to be a parent when they have a child. Honestly, they don't. It sounds like the one thing that you are absolutely determined and confirmed in is the knowledge that you wish to be a mother. And that's because within you there are these natural nurturing qualities, there is this compassion base, there is this just absolute knowledge that you are destined to be a mother. And I put that in the range of what we talk about with mothering, from giving birth to your own, whether it's IVF or treatment based in that respect, or whether you look elsewhere, such as in adoption. You are born to be a mother in that way. That is not a bad thing to confirm. Secondly, you're going to take some time to heal some of those wounds, and you might need some help doing that. But what I'd say really firmly to you is, I believe massively in visions. I'm not talking about imagining something bizarre and then it happening. I'm talking about true visions where you just know that there's a linear thread between what you feel and what you expect to occur. You clearly have that. Your mothering is on its way. These setbacks are painful. They will make you angry. They will make you frustrated. They will make you, at times, desperately emotional. You need to speak to your partner. He does not think you are letting him down at all. Under any circumstances will that thought cross his mind. But what he may do is he may find it difficult to talk to you about your losses because he doesn't know how it feels. His expectation is you know he's on side, and he doesn't realise you need that reassurance. What women will often do when they miscarry is they'll start rejecting themselves and their body, making themselves the problem. 2 people get pregnant. If there are any issues within that, from the sperm to the egg, that's 2 people involved. So you're on a journey right now. It's painful. I do not underestimate it. But at the same time, there is a clear vision. I'm sending you lots of love and hugs as well, because I know that this is incredibly painful. But just keep your eye on that vision that you're going to be a mama. And even though, again, I don't want to underestimate the loss of what you've gone through, it's huge. I want to tell you the one thing that really made sense to me when I did lose my babies, and that was you would never choose any other child than the children that you birth, right? You might have wanted a million more, but when it comes down to it, the child that you birth is going to be birthed because of some of these losses. And the consequence means that they will be the one that's destined for you to some degree. And it's frustrating as hell. Dr. Stowe, where's your position on that and what your thoughts are within that?
So I find it hard to add much to that. Emma, I suppose the one thing that I was thinking about at the time was that, so when me and my wife had our children roughly within a year or two. Most of my friends my close friends, we all went to university together, had kids around the same time. And the one thing that kind of struck me was how common miscarriages are. I think they're far more common than people really understand, because it's not something you really generally share. Even friends that I was quite close with only really mentioned that they'd had miscarriages once we brought it up, because that's what happened with my wife. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it might feel really isolating at the time, and it might feel like you're the only one going through it. But actually, in actuality, I think it is a very, very common experience, actually. And people, my wife, yourself, Emma included, it's absolutely horrific at the time, but there is a future. There is a timeline where you eventually get the things that you're looking for. So it might not feel like that at this moment in time, but people do eventually have children. That doesn't happen to everybody. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that some people really want to have children, they can't, and that is a grief, and it is a loss for them. And I also have friends that I can think of that are in that situation, but they're not unhappy people that have unfulfilling lives by any means at all. They just have to kind of adjust with the hands that are dealt. But again, just to emphasize that it's a very small proportion. And also, I mean, you said this yourself, Emma, but I think it's really important for your viewer to talk to her partner, because you might be making assumptions that are just incorrect. You might be thinking that your partner is thinking some quite unhelpful and negative thoughts about yourself that you might be completely off the scale. You might just be, because of the traumatic experience that you've had, you might be looking at everything through a slightly negative, pessimistic lens, which is not the real you. It's just you going through this kind of experience. So I definitely talk to him.
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense, full stop, actually, when I think we're dealing with any critical issue, even if it's affecting our partner as well. I think our desire to seek to control our environment because we don't want to feel vulnerable can really work against us. So the sense of, well, if I just blame myself and if I blame my body, then somehow I'll figure out how to make it work, and then I'll be able to change the outcome. And whilst on one level, survival mechanic wise, you're like, okay, well, that kind of makes sense because then I'm fully in control. It's a little bit like when Dr. Sohn was talking about people who develop phobias and looking at desensitization work, and you think about a really traumatic event. Let's say you're walking down an alley and you get your purse stolen and you're assaulted. It makes perfect sense that you think to yourself, well, if I hadn't been walking down that alley by myself, then that would never have happened, and therefore you decide I'll never go out of my home, right? It's a really massively amplified reaction, but actually it's based to some degree in a desire to wish to control the environment so you don't confront it and face it again. And the problem with that, of course, is it creates these massive limiting experiences on our life and our experience outside. So what we have to be able to do is to say, well, you know what? It's actually not my fault. This happened, but it's not my fault. There is a combination or cultivation of factors. And certainly with miscarriage, one of the things that I would definitely know is you have got pregnant twice. I know it's going to be terrifying for you to get pregnant again. I know it's going to be scary for you to imagine getting past that first 12 weeks, 14 weeks, but it's great that you got pregnant. And I cannot tell you, having been through all of those journeys where I just can't do that, that's a good story and a good premonition when it comes down to the future. So just be peaceful with that as well. And also, before I move on to the next one, get some acupuncture. Nice guidelines approved. It's very good to relax with. Anything that can just bring you into a sense of body, mind, emotional connection and balance will be helpful. I promise. I have a serious question. I love this when you start with, I have a serious question, because it scares me a little. I haven't read the rest of it, but I'm going to do that now. I have a serious question. I'm a first year as a junior solicitor and would like to get your advice on one question. Is being a paedophile a gene, or is this something that can be rehabilitated? I have seen some things in my line of work and want to see if there is a disorder of some sort. I'll say what I think. Dr. Sohom is obviously a real expert in this area. So I have an obsession with researching all of these new shall we say, theories. It doesn't mean that I have a working experience of putting that into practice. However, so paedophilia is a spectrum. We must remember that. There are paedophiles up at this level who have a predilection for an interest in children who would never touch a child, who have normally satisfactory sexual relationships with partners who are of consenting age, might spend their lives married, know that they have these feelings towards children, never act on them. So clearly that is still somebody who is a paedophile as far as attraction base, but they're not a child molester. And then we can kind of move down the grade. So we have child, in my opinion, molesters, because they are witnessing material that has been made because those predilections exist, such as pornography online. As far as I'm concerned, the minute that you watch that stuff, you are now violating a child. You have not got physical contact with them, but you're still violating them. Then we move down to those who, shall we say, groom children, believe in a very skewed way that they're in a loving relationship with a child, so they're not the violently aggressive perpetrators, which is highly confusing for the child, because obviously this is the loving adult in their life who is being kind but is also molesting them. And then of course, right down at the bottom of the spectrum, we have the cases where, as we look at Cherish Periwinkle in the States, is horrifically murdered by a prolific paedophile and child killer. So that spectrum is big. So first of all, if a spectrum is very big, we can't look at it as a one size fits all, because clearly there are some people who would never offend. There are those who are attractive and even call themselves virtuous paedophiles who would never offend or look at material and believe it's wrong. And then we have those who become contact offences and so on and so forth. Now, whether you are born with that, whether you develop that, I mean, the jury is definitely going to be out because of the fact that we don't know every paedophile in the world and we can't interview them. I found some really interesting stuff from the States where they are looking at brain scans and they are believing that the area of parental care and the altruistic genes that are involved in naturally feeling protective towards children, in certain paedophiles, they feel that the connection isn't formed correctly and it goes to a more sexual area, meaning that arguably when the individual sees a child, then it activates an area of the brain which is attractiveness, which is something that would mean that they weren't choosing that. It's just a part of their experience. And then I suppose the other side would be that certainly individuals who have had highly traumatic situations as children and maybe to some degree immaturity emotionally, that they don't relate to adults, could also additionalize that kind of attraction. But I'm going to pass over to the psychiatrist who actually works in this, because when Dr. Soham has talked about forensic, even though you would put them on the same level as clinical, you know, as in psychiatrists who are more in clinical settings like NHS settings, obviously Dr. Soham, he works with high-level forensic offenders who actually do this, so with child abusers and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so your viewer was right. That's definitely a serious question, isn't it?
It is.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. We're just testing you this evening.
Okay, so I think the question was: is it genetic or can it be rehabilitated? I don't think it's an either or, but I'll take them one at a time. So, is it genetic? I think probably like most psychiatric or psychological disorders, it is multifactorial, and genetics does play a part in it, but probably quite a minor part. So, for example, people who generally have personality traits are about 50% hereditary. So whether that's antisocial, aggressive, sexually deviant, they're into paraphilias, there is definitely a genetic component. They will run in families. But I think that what makes it really complicated is that it's really hard to separate nature from nurture when you're talking about people who themselves have been abused as children. So if somebody has been abused by, say, their parents, and they themselves become abusers, and we know that's very common, is that because they inherited something in their genes, or is it because they're reliving their experience? And I would argue it's probably more the nurture than it is the nature. So we know that people who have been abused tend to recreate the cycle for many reasons. One is like modeling the behavior that they see. So that's fairly straightforward. Sometimes it's about believing that there needs to be a power dynamic. There needs to be some sort of, sex or power dominance in between a adult and a child rather than just an empathetic and emotional kind of connection. So it's hardwired into them that they think that's normal because it's what they've experienced themselves. And sometimes it's as simple as they have been victimized for so long that they just have all this pent up frustration and hatred and rage, and they take it out the only way that they know how. So I suppose what I'm saying in a long-winded way is I do think genetics play a small part in it, but I also think it's a lot more environmental and the lack of just areas of disinhibition, whether that's personality. Some of it is actually to do with genes and enzymes. So, for example, I don't know if you ever heard of the warrior gene, but
MAOA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So because of an increase in enzymes, you've got a decreased amounts of certain neurotransmitters, which is going to change your affinity towards offending or not. So there's definitely genetic components, but I suppose I don't know if we'll ever really know the answer because it is just so complex and multifactorial. And you said yourself, we're never going to have a decent research cohort that we can research with. We might have people who have been caught committing who've been caught committing sexual acts on children, but they're not representative of the whole spectrum of paedophilia, as you said yourself. So we could only really study from quite a skewed perspective.
So with your rehabilitation side of it, the question about the rehabilitation, where are you on that?
Yeah. So can some people be rehabilitated who are paedophiles? The answer is yes. And I know that's probably not what some people want to hear, but that's the truth. So on the more straightforward end of the spectrum, and again, I think everybody's on not just the spectrum of how harsh or horrific their actions are related to paedophilia, but also how rehabilitatable they are. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got somebody who clearly has their offending related to mental illness. So they've got something like schizophrenia or bipolar affective disorder, and they get manic. When they get manic, they get disinhibited, they get more aggressive, they become more impulsive, they don't think through the consequence of their actions. That is, at least in theory, relatively easy to treat. So you find the right medication and the right therapy that gives you some insight about when you're getting ill, and you can take away those symptoms of mental illness, then you can massively reduce their risk of future offending. You make sure that they see their psychiatrist regularly, they see their psychologist for therapy regularly, and they take their medication, crucially, and then in theory, their risk of sexual offending has massively decreased. And then you get people on the other end of the spectrum where it's more linked with sexual perversion and their own personality. And as we all know, that's much, much harder to treat.
Yeah.
As you'd expect in my patient group, most people are somewhere in between. So there's different levels. I think there definitely have been people that I've worked with who, as far as we know, because at some point you have to discharge them, and you have to, if you think they're safe enough to live in the community, then you have to take that plunge. And even though it's a graded step, so you try them with leave over a long period of time, at some point you have to release them into society. And I've definitely seen some patients that would commit some behaviours that are akin to grooming, and they've paid their debt to society, they've been in prison, etc., and then years later we rehabilitate them in our psychiatric system, and they still have the same delectations and the same kind of urges, but they learn to control their behavior either through talking about it through therapy, through other means such as masturbating, but outside of actual sexual activity through children. So there are a group of people that can go through that, but equally there are some people that I think will never change, and they don't really have a place within our rehabilitation system.
Yeah.
They deserve to be in prison possibly for the rest of their lives, depending on the severity of their actions. So there are so many people that fit into so many different categories, and it's really hard to know unless you assess them over a prolonged period of time and observe them which category they'll fall into. But the summary of my answer is yes, some people are rehabilitatable and can be treated, whereas some people can't, and you can never really predict unless you assess them thoroughly.
And Dr. Soma is a nicer human being than me, because as you all know, throughout my training and throughout pushing by some of my clinical supervisors who tried to get me to work with sex offenders, and it probably would have been very good for my professional development, I genuinely decided it was not something I could do because I felt that I'd be too judgmental, which would make me an incredibly unhelpful person to be working with them. You really have to be able to manage compassion in a way that I think, and I do consider myself compassionate, empathic, and I do consider myself someone who really does care about my fellow man, but I also know my limits, as in me being useful in that paradigm. So I do take my hat off to you, Dr. Soham, because I think it is something that takes a very special capacity and ability to be able to look into the eyes of an individual who may have done some of the most heinous things that you could ever have read about, let alone have sat and heard about, and still see the humanity within them. And there is humanity within the vast majority. Obviously, I do believe some should be placed on a direct lift down to hell. I do not deny those feelings, but that's why I would be so bad at working in that area, and it's why it's so important that people like you exist. So it's now, with 7 minutes over the hour, so apologies for that. That's what happens. I've seen loads and loads of questions coming in, and I just want to make sure that genuinely all of you realise that it's not that we haven't wanted to cover them, it's just that they come in, and they're also very important that we cover the ones that have come in appropriately. I was going to say, just before we do wrap up, and also just bring it in, it's all linked anyway, but you can get this, it's on Amazon. The easiest place is probably to buy it on Amazon, is that right, Dr. Soham, or is there somewhere direct that they can go that we can add?
Amazon is, I think it's available in some bookshops. That's what I've been told by my publishers, but I've never seen it. So I think Amazon's
well, I mean, if there are some, listen, if you've got a local bookshop, guys, go into your local bookshop, because it's not like Jeff Bezos, let's remove the bridge in Belgium because my massive super yacht's too big to get out. It's not like he's going to worry if you go to a nice independent and buy, but it is easy to get off it, and honestly, it's a genuinely great read. And you know what I like? I love my reading anyway, and I'll read books because of the fact that I think it enhances my own emotional intelligence, etc. But it's a great book, and like I said, I'm not right at the end yet, but I'm considerably towards the end. So it's really, really excellent and really, really informative for me as a practitioner. But I'm sure for you guys, you'll be like, oh, this is... It was a bit like when I got Oliver Sacks's book, The Man Who Thought He Was a Hat, and I was like, amazing. It's very similar. It's bite-sized chunks, which makes it really, really good. But before we kind of sign off, personally for me, Dr. Soham, one of the things that I think has been really challenging for my listeners for years, I mean, we've been doing this for years. It hasn't just been across the pandemic. My lives have been going on forever. But right now, people are in a position where economically we are in a different world compared to how we've been in the last 10 years. People are choosing whether to heat or to eat. A lot of the people who view this already have mental health issues. I'm not saying illnesses, just mental health issues. You know, they're struggling with certain elements of the mental health. Familial issues because of the fact that there are extra stresses being placed in. A lot of people who have spent the COVID period terrified because they genuinely thought that they might kill their family members, and that they found it really difficult as people have moved out of the pandemic into a more normal way of life. And equally, a lot of people feeling really burdened with the frustration and anger of the liberty that they had stolen from them in the past few years. I think that anxiety, we know, is through the roof. Depression is through the roof. Antidepressants are just being, don't even get me started on the whole, how dare the pharmaceutical industry prey more on that and get even more, but that's my own stuff. But, you know, we have an unhappy nation, and we're seeing unhappy children. I work with some one of the charities, and what I on top as individuals being overwhelmed. Don't worry, if you can hear me, I'm there, but you might not be able to see me at the moment. But could you just talk to me a little bit about what your opinion is right now about how people are feeling coming out of this situation?
About how people are kind of adjusting to life after the pandemic.
Yeah, and what you're seeing, and like, if you've got any advice. It was a big question. Look, I covered every single area there. What do you think personally, and how are you feeling about, you know, this new current position where, you know, economically we are struggling, mental health we are struggling, people don't have as much, people are struggling to eat and heat. How will people manage mental health more effectively when dealing with these extra pressures that obviously create even more stress in their lives? Have you got any little take-home pieces of information that would be helpful?
Yeah, I do. So I think that I don't want to add to the doom and gloom, but I do think that everything you're saying is, well, not everything, but some elements might be getting even worse. So we need to brace ourselves. We need to be ready for that. The cost of living, it has already increased, and I think it's going to get worse, certainly over the next few months. And I only say that because I think people need to have a realistic outlook.
Honest.
And if you're not expecting it, it's gonna hurt a lot more when the sting finally comes. Unfortunately, so first of all, I'll answer what I'm seeing. So as you know, I mainly deal with people who've committed fairly serious offences, and unfortunately, because services are so overstretched, what I've been seeing pre-pandemic, but certainly accelerated by the pandemic, is that the threshold to get into hospital now is higher than it ever has been before. So you have to be like floridly psychotic, hearing voices, or this close to actually having killed yourself to get into hospitals. And I'm ashamed to say that as a psychiatrist, but that's what I'm seeing.
It's how a lot of people on this live, just to say, a lot of people are saying that they've been trying to turn up to get help at A&E for saying they're suicidal and just getting sent home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I reflect that to the people that we're seeing in court as well, where I work. And because the threshold's so high, there's this mass of people who've got very significant problems who probably need hospitalization and would have got into hospital 5 or 10 years ago, but they can't. And the knock-on effect of that is that the community teams who are trying to deal with those people are not able to see the people who I would consider being on a rung lower than that. So they've still got serious problems. They still need help, but they just can't access it. So what I'm seeing is that people are getting into the system committing pettier crimes than they would have done a few years ago. So we're seeing people that are coming in who are street homeless, who are struggling with massive poverty issues, who are committing low-level offences like stealing, or even some people that are committing offences just to get into prison.
I understand that. I understand that. Streets,
which is mind-blowing. Like,
I get that.
A civilized country to see that, and not just like one thing that I've seen once that's like a war story for my grandkids. It's a thing that I'm seeing regularly, and it really is very sickening, very sad. As to what we can do about it, I mean, I don't have a magic answer for you, I'm afraid, but the one thing I would say is that I think that a lot more treatments have moved online. And again, I think it was already happening pre-pandemic, but it's been accelerated by that. And I have to say, to my surprise, I'm getting feedback from patients who are saying that it's a lot more helpful than they expected. So I am maybe slightly technophobic, is that the right word? Like slightly...
I'm the same.
Cynical.
I'm the same.
Cynical about doing things online, and like I do quite a lot of assessments online nowadays, which we didn't do pre-pandemic. And to my surprise, it's actually more effective than I thought it would be. And I'm hearing from other patients that either self-help or apps or online therapy is more effective than they assume. So I think that speaks to my bias rather than the effectiveness of the therapy. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I would advise people to keep an open mind, that I think that getting access to, so one of my patients is telling me about this like CBT app, and you don't ever really interact with a human, but it's very effective at asking you the right questions. So at asking you how you're feeling in certain situations, getting you to think about the reason why, questioning whether that's a reasonable way to be reacting to a situation. And if you can identify that it isn't, then giving you little homework tasks to change little aspects of how you've been acting, and then reassess the situation in a week or in a fortnight. So it's basically, it is CBT, but it's kind of done on algorithms and on an app. And again, even saying it out loud, part of me is kind of cynical about it, but I think it does work. And I think that we have to adapt to the environment. And if the environment is that you can't see your psychologist or psychiatrist for 3 or 4 months or 6 months, then we should keep an open mind of trying the more technology than perhaps we're initially comfortable with.
I mean, I think it's better than nothing, isn't it? And certainly the online over the video situation, I mean, I hate it, but I do it. I hate it purely because I like to make somebody a cup of tea and sit down and just feel that we've got that intimate space. But arguably, a lot of people feel like not having to leave their home is really helpful. Time frame wise, it means that they're going to be an hour, not 2 hours. if they've got anxiety, they're not necessarily having to go through the protocol of leaving and doing all those things that are difficult. And when you've got depression, sometimes just getting out of your front door, you're a warrior, isn't it? So again, I can see the positives. And yeah, we do have to adapt to that climate without a doubt. And
also, if you don't like your therapist, you just pretend that your Wi-Fi is not working.
Yeah. Or just shut it. Just be more overt. Be more overt with it. Just be like, I don't like you. And then it's gone. So I'm with you. Listen, excuse me, we've taken up a lot more of your time than I was meant to. I was meant to take an hour and I've taken an hour and a quarter because I'm that kind of person. It's like, if I can drag Dr. Soham on here for free as well, he's giving up his time for free. Excuse me. Honestly, guys, I did my tour the other night and I can only thank God that I didn't lose it halfway through. Seriously. I am getting better from this flipping cold. But like I said, I've linked below the In Two Minds. Hopefully we'll be able to drag him back again. Now we've had him once and he's realised how lovely you all are. But thank you so much, Dr. Soham. You've been amazing. What's your YouTube channel again so that everybody can go and it is very humorous and very informative. And as you will have seen today, very eloquent. So it's very easy to understand what Dr. Soham does and says. It's not one of those where you're going to be sitting there thinking, I don't really get this. It's very accessible and it's also really interesting to kind of pick up on things. Even tonight, some of the words that he's used to explain things that some of you will experience but haven't yet formulated a word for it. There's so many of those on his channel. So I really do say go over there. So what's that?
Thank you, Emma, for such a glowing review, and I'd love to come on again. And thank you for having me. My YouTube channel is called A Psych for Sore Minds.
That's a great one, A Psych for Sore Minds.
Yeah, so
really good.
2 puns in one phrase.
I love it. Listen, take care, guys, and thank you again. And we'll speak soon, Dr. Soham. Okay?
Thank you so much, Emma. I hope you get over your cough.
Oh, thanks. It's fine. It's, you know how it is. I come from a world where we used to just have things like chest infections. Who knew they'd have banned those in the last few years? I'm just like one of those classic people who's like, it's the cold, move forward. But yeah, you take care. We'll catch up soon. And thanks to everybody joining me as ever. You're all adored.